For a lot of you, you might be experiencing cold weather and you might have some wool fabrics lying around that you haven't sewn up yet. Today is all about how to sew with wool fabric. Super practical. It's going to really help you tackle your next wool project. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing, and today I have an episode all about fabric. In this case, the fabric is wool. I have made fabric movies in the past, including linen, rayon, and others. I have a playlist all about these specific episodes all about fabric. Not all fabrics are the same, not all have the same treatment and the way that you deal with them when you're sewing. So this could be really helpful if you've never sewn with wool before. Wool is amazing. I wish I lived in a colder climate so I could use it more often and sew it more often. Context, I live in Brazil and my winters get very mild. At the end of last year, I shared with you all of my wool collection. So if you want to see all the pretty fabric I have in my collection, go ahead and watch that one. It's so amazing. And I'm always looking at it. It's up there in a cupboard. Starting when I was a teenager, I made so many wool garments because back then I lived in Chile where it got really cold. So I do have quite a bit of experience sewing with wool, even though I'm not sewing with it as frequently as I used to in the past. I wanted to let you know that Itch to Stitch is running a sale. Kenneth, who owns Itch to Stitch, is her birthday, and to celebrate, she's running this 20% off site-wide sale through Saturday the 1st of February. You don't need to type in any code. The discount will be applied at checkout, super easy. And throughout this wool video, you will see some of the patterns I mentioned and show. From Itch to Stitch, she has great instructions for lining, wool projects like the leg and coat, and also for binding the Kirstu cape, which are projects I used making wool that are from Itch to Stitch. So if you want to see more about the brand, highly recommend. I've got the playlist for all my makes linked also, as well as my affiliate link. If you use my affiliate link, I do receive a small commission, and it's one of the ways I make an income creating helpful videos here on YouTube. Top of the comment section, pinned, easy to find. I want to share all the tips I have picked up and everything that's going to help you make something out of wool. It's amazing to work with. A garment that's made out of wool is really hard wearing, it's hard to stain, it's temperature controlling, and it's really durable. Now, I have to preface that my wool fabrics are not 100% wool. I haven't sewn with 100% wool in quite a while. All my wool fabrics are blends. I would still treat them the same way because there is wool in the composition. Now, what are the pros to working with this type of fabric? Most of them are stable. They're easy to cut. They're easy to sew. If you make a tiny little mistake, a little wobble in your seam, it's really forgiving for small mistakes. I think it can be easier to set in sleeves. When you have to ease in a sleeve, it takes that extra volume there really well. There are cons if you consider a few extra steps, cons, because it's not as easy as working with a cotton or a denim, for example. There's extra steps that you might want to take when you're cutting, when you're sewing, when you're interfacing. The way that you press is different. The way that you pre-treat it is different. One thing that you need to consider if you're working with a heavier fabric is that because the fabric is heavier and thicker, it might turn out to have less positive ease than what you think. So if you made the exact same pattern in a cotton twill, using the same pattern pieces, the same size, everything, and you made that same jacket out of a heavy wool, the heavy wool material is going to feel smaller and tighter. So that's something to consider, especially if you're using a pattern that doesn't have that much positive ease. You might want to consider sizing up or half a size up, because the thickness of the fabric itself takes away from the space that you get inside the garment. Sometimes it can be scratchy, and this is very personal. Some people don't mind wool. I am a person that minds it a lot. I always need to line my garments. So just knowing from the get-go that there's a high chance that you might need to line something, if that's not something you're comfortable with, and all those extra steps bother you, then this might be considered a con. I don't consider it a con, I just think it's part of it. It means that you're going to have to look for a pattern that has lining included in the pattern. Unless you know how to draft your own lining pieces and all of that, it could sort of limit your pattern choices. Then there's the thing about cost. These fabrics tend to be more expensive. It depends on how they are and how they're made. But I've been known to buy some that are super expensive. I've got them there, they're precious. The bouclés I have, oh my gosh, so expensive. So that could be a con compared to the cost of other fabrics. But then they're going to last and they're going to look amazing. So it's an investment. Now, where do you store these? I store them at the top of one of my cupboards in my son's room because he had all that empty space there that was just begging to be filled up with fabric. there's these little ventilation things in the wood there, so it's always ventilated, and I'm always going in there to look anyway, so it's not always cramped up in there getting damp. You also need to worry about moths. We have a man come over here and get rid of the bugs every 6 months, so I've actually never seen a moth in my house, so that's good because they would love to get at that wall. So just make sure you don't store it in a really tight container, like a plastic container or something like that. Just have it in a place where it can breathe and just be happy resting there until it's time for it to get sewn into something. Now, about how you pre-wash this or pre-treat it, it's something you definitely don't just throw in the wash. That would be a disaster. One thing that it would fray quite a lot, most of them, and it would shrink amazingly. I mean, I'm talking about 50% shrinkage here. You could ruin the fabric. So don't do that. Another option, if you want to spend a lot of money, is to take all your fabric. I would serge the edges just to protect them and take the fabric to the dry cleaners. I've never done that. I would never do that because it's so expensive, but I know someone might want to, so that's always an option. And then there's another way that I've never done because I just don't trust the process, but I know it's out there and I know some people do it like that. And it's just to put your wool material in your dryer and just put a damp towel in there and just let it go there for 10 minutes or something. And that's going to help it get damp a little bit. And if it's going to be a little bit of shrinking, it's going to happen with that process. The way that I find more practical is just to do it yourself on the ironing board. Now, this is something that everyone has, I suppose. If you're sewing, you have a nice ironing board and an iron with steam. And that's all I do. This is a wool blend suiting material, and there's no way I'm going to throw this into the washing machine. That is not the way I would wash the finalized garment ever. So just to give it a prep, I'm giving it a good steam. I'm not making the iron touch the fabric at all. I've just got it on full steam and going back and forth and just steaming the fabric. I'm going to let it just dry out like this, extended, and when it's nice and dry, I'll start working on it. This steaming process will allow the fabric to shrink if it wants to shrink a little bit. And this is how I prepare any wool blend suitings. I actually don't have any wool suiting material that is 100% wool. All of mine are blends, but I still do the same preparation. So just to make it clear, I'm not actually ironing the fabric directly. I don't want to scorch it or make it shiny. I've got my iron full of water at the highest steam setting and I'm pressing on the button and I'm hovering over the fabric like that much distance. And I'm like, shh, 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 the whole thing. And then I keep moving the fabric until I've done the whole lot. It can take quite a while because it depends on how big your fabric is, how much yardage you have. So it can take a while. It's just part of it. And then I just put it on my cutting board and I just let it sit there until it's fully dry. And I take that as my pre-treating, and that's the way I'm going to steam it and let it shrink a little bit, get it nice and soft and ready to be used. For cutting your wool fabric, it can get a little bit exhausting. You need sharp tools so that the process can be easier and faster. If you're using a scissors, I have done in the past, I've really hurt my hands just cutting. It just really hurts your hand because you're cutting through heavy fabric. It's just not the same as cutting rayon, or even cutting cotton or linen with the scissors is not as exhausting as cutting wool. So I would cut a few pieces. Sometimes I cut pieces that are just easier with the scissors, like facings, but mostly I will use a sharp rotary cutter. I think that's just more accurate, more precise, it's faster, it gets the job done. If the fabric is super heavy, then you might consider cutting in a single layer, not in a double layer. But I've been known to cut heavy fabric in 2 layers, and I'm just like really going for it with the rotary cut. I'm like, using all my muscles, but consider that. Also, you can consider avoiding cutting things on the fold, especially if your fabric is quite heavy. That folded area, it could be quite a lot of space and it can lead to human error, especially around necklines and things. Especially with facings, I create facings that are extended. If you only have half a pattern piece that says cut on the fold, I extend. So do that. Extra steps, I know, but wool is special and there's always going to be a few extra steps, especially with the cutting. Now, about marking your wool fabric, there's also a few little things I need to talk about. It's difficult to make a difference visually, which is the right and the wrong side. They could look pretty much exactly the same. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. I tend to buy these boucle type of wools. I just love the texture, but they're always very loosely woven. Now, in this case, you can tell clearly which is the difference here. This is the wrong side. It's very flat. It has a different texture. And these golden threads look different. And you can clearly see that this is the right side of the fabric. So for this one, it would be easy. But for others, they look pretty much the same. Check out this one. This one is purple and black. It's got both types of colors. And if you turn it to this side, it looks very the same. There's barely any difference. So you just need to choose which one it is. I'm going to choose this one as the right side because I feel that the texture comes up a little further, the black areas. In this one, it's a little flatter, very subtle difference. So what I would do here while I'm cutting out, I would just take chalk and do some lines like this on my wrong sides all over, just so that I know, and this is going to last throughout my construction so that I don't get confused and I end up sewing right side to wrong side and things like that, having things not turn out mirrored. So just mark the wrong side when you're cutting out as you're cutting out all your pieces and you won't be confused. So you can see in the images here that I've got a cape, lots of pieces here, and I marked them as I was cutting out. You can see there's lots of marks with chalk there that's going to come out. I know exactly which is the right and the wrong side when I'm sewing, so I don't end up sewing things wrong, getting things not mirrored. You know, it can be really confusing. So if you just know you have to mark everything from the get-go, it's going to make the process a little easier. Sometimes marking is not so easy. It's not straightforward like other fabrics. You just really can't grab all the same tools and use the same techniques on the fabric because the fabric won't take your marking tool. It's the wrong side of my wall, and if I had to mark little dashes on armholes, like single or double marks, that would be easy to do with a regular coloring pencil. It's a regular one for kids. I use yellow all the time. I keep a glass and I just dip it a little. It only takes a few seconds for this to soften up. And then you can easily mark little things like this, dots and dashes, always within the seam allowance. This is something that's not going to come out easily, so you never want to do a whole dot mark or something that's actually going to be on the garment. It's always just on the edge. So that works really well. Friction pen, you will never be able to mark that. It just won't mark, it won't last. This is a dark color, but if this was a lighter color, I would have problems marking with a friction pen. So it's not that great. And then you have these types of chalks that are waxy. You could get a mark done maybe on the edges, but they would easily come off if you're ironing while you're sewing, which is something that you need to do for a wool. So that's why I prefer the dipped coloring pencil to the chalk for tiny marks like that. Do you do if you need to mark dots and other things that are larger? For other fabrics, I would probably use a tracing paper. And I find that for these fabrics, it just does not mark very well. And if it marks, it will last only a little bit. So let's just make a mark. You can barely see it. I can see it faintly, very faintly. So this is what I would actually do. This is why this takes so long. I would mark my dot. Let's mark a dot here. I can see it. And while I can still see it, very faintly, I would come with my thread and just do some stitches to mark it. That's how I would do it. And I would do the same for buttonhole marks. So thread marking is the way to go. Usually it will last throughout your project. It's not going to come out as you iron your project, each seam as you go. I'm actually sure you're not going to see this, but I have my yellow thread going across there, it stops there, and then it starts going down here. So now I can just take my pocket, find my reference perfectly right there, and place it where. For the back dots, I had a bit more of a problem marking those because I did it with a tracing paper for sewing. And although the mark stayed, it was quickly coming out before my eyes. So I decided to mark those dots with thread while I could still see the mark that the tracing paper made. Any type of tracing tool is not going to stay very long on this type of fabric, so that's why I used the coloring pencil for little dots and dashes. I'm not going to mark a whole dot with that. I have marked the reference for this fake work pocket with thread. Where the thread comes out of the fabric is where the pocket should start. So yeah, even simple things like marking your notches and your dots and everything can be lengthier than with other fabrics. That's why I'm saying wool is special. It deserves more time. Whenever I've dedicated time to sew a project like this, I know I'm going to spend a few hours just cutting and interfacing and marking and all of that. Now you usually have pieces that need interfacing, like facings, collar pieces and all of that. So block fusing is the way to go. Block fusing just means you cut a piece of fabric slightly larger than the pattern piece that you need to interface. you interface that piece of fabric and then you put your pattern piece on top and cut out. It's always going to work. This is my back facing piece. I'm block fusing as always. I'm using very, very lightweight interfacing. It's basically almost transparent. It's non-stretch and fusible. So I've got it already fused on there. You can see my fabric is a little larger. I was quite generous there. And as I mentioned, I was going to add 3/8 seam allowance to the bottom of this facing here so that I have seam allowance to sew it to the lining that's coming underneath. So I've marked it there with a pen, 3/8 seam allowance, and that's what I'm going to cut. And then the rest, I'm just going to trim like normal around the edges. Block fusing always gives you a really accurate result. You can see the facing is exactly the facing piece. No change. If shrinkage happened, it already did. So this is going to match exactly the shape of the armhole and the neckline. It's always going to be super accurate. If the adhesive on your fusible interfacing reacted to the fabric and made it shrink a little bit, it's going to do it. It's going to happen before you cut out your pattern piece, which means when you cut it, it's going to be exactly the same size and nothing would have changed. It never fails. Now, when your fabric is really loosely woven, I've been known to interface the whole thing. And I'm not talking about just collars and edges and things. I'm talking about huge pattern pieces. And I've done that with my Coda coat that I made in 2023. I made it to look a Chanel-esque type of vibe. And yeah, the whole thing. It's got a fairly loose weave. You can see the fibers going through. You can see it'll unravel pretty easily. I think it could snag very easily. So from the get-go, I decided I was going to interface the whole thing. Now, I can't give you brands because I buy generic brands over here, but I'll show it to you. You can see how lightweight it is. It's basically sheer. This is interfacing that's fusible and it doesn't stretch at all. It's very easy to fuse on, lightweight, and I'm going to cut every single piece and interface them. I'm going to be interfacing every single piece with this for the whole jacket, the pockets, the flaps, the main pieces, everything. So I use this for everything and I keep quite a large amount of yardage. This wool is super loosely woven. I know over time it can deform and it could be super easy for it to snag on things. So I'm just going to use a lot of interfacing and interface every single piece. You can see I'm interfacing the back here, which is cut on the fold. I am block fusing, so you can see there's a shape there, but it's actually a little bigger than my pattern piece. Once all of this piece is interfaced, then I'll put my actual pattern piece on top and cut the piece, just trim off the edges because I don't want my pieces shrinking while I interface all the surface. It is a lengthy process. I did separate a whole day to be able to do this, to just cut and interface all the pieces. It does take a long time. It can be a little bit tiring, but for a fabric like this, I think it's totally worth it. This is my sleeve. It's already interfaced the whole piece. You can see it's a little bit larger than my piece. I cut out all my pattern pieces like this, and then I'm going in with my rotary cutter. It's quite a thick layer here. There are 2 layers of the wool plus the interfacing. Maybe I should have done it in a single layer, so I'm really struggling there with the rotary cutter, but it was possible to do. So that took a lot of time, and I did consider buying extra yardage of my fusible interfacing so that it would be enough to interface everything, sleeves, all the things. Sometimes you need to interface bodice pieces, especially on coats. Sometimes you have large areas that are interfaced and it helps it to look not fluffy. Sometimes wool material can look a little bit fluffy if it's not interfaced. Sometimes you find interfacing on bodice pieces like you see there. That's my legging coat from Itch to Stitch in an amazing herringbone with like splashes of golden paint on the fabric. It's amazing. And that one had quite a few pieces that were interfaced. The whole bodice, the waistband pieces. What thread to use? Let's keep it simple. I think you're sewing most of your projects with polyester thread. It's universal. It works for everything. It's nice and strong. It can take a lot of heat when you're ironing. It's not going to break apart. When you're pressing this, you're going to use
high temperature settings and a lot of steam, so polyester is going to be fine. Let's keep it simple.
In regards to the needle, let's keep it simple and just use a universal needle. Of course, the size will depend on the weight of your fabric. I'm typically using 90 for most of my wool fabrics. 80 if it's a little lighter. I've never actually had a wool that was that light for me to use a 70. So I think 90 is the one that you'll use the most. Stitch length, you're probably using a straight stitch because that's what we use to sew woven fabrics. And if you think that the fabric is heavier and bulkier, I would use a longer stitch length. So if you're used to using 2.5 for lighter fabrics, I would probably increase it to 3 or even 3.2, 3.5. Just depends on how many layers you're going through and how that feels on the machine. How about seam finishes? This is a lot to do with personal preference. You have many options here. You can use simple serging with your machine. It's perfectly acceptable. If you have a lightweight fabric that it's not going to be lined, go ahead and serge your fabric. I usually do it before I even start sewing the project because I know I'm going to be pressing these seams open, and some of these fabrics can fray a lot. Some don't fray that much. Just evaluate on a case-by-case basis, but I tend to serge before I sew. What you're seeing me serge there is my encore skirt from Love Notions I made at the end of the year. Very, very loosely woven, lots of fraying going on. It's a skirt I fully lined. And even though it was lined, you know, because it's not closed at the bottom with the lining, I did serge all the edges. So serging looks really, really good. This is an amazing wool material. You can see how it's weaved. There's plenty of different types of colors in there. It was fraying quite a lot. So one of the first steps I did before putting it together was to serge the edges separately and then press them open. Serge seam is perfectly fine. This is a shirt or jacket. Because the fabric isn't too heavy, it's, I'd say, light to medium weight. I didn't want to weigh it down by doing binding on the edges. I would do binding if the wool was a little heavier. So just think about that. I think this is a perfectly acceptable seam finish here. Same as for the bottom of the hem. It's all serged and it's all perfectly fine. You can also use binding to finish all the edges, the Hong Kong finish. Fancy name for it. I just call it binding. And I would make my own. I don't typically like store-bought bias tape. It doesn't have a good texture and it could be too stiff. I like making my bias tape out of a really light cotton or a rayon. I think that's amazing. And you can use that to bind all the seams. I'm making my own binding here. I'm making bias tape that's going to be 1 inch wide finished. This is the bias tape maker. It has a 25mm on the back. So basically when you use these bias tape makers, you cut the piece double the width of the 25mm, which would be 50, which is 5 centimeters or 2 inches. So those are the white lines you see here on the bias at 45 degrees. So I'm just drawing them all the way as much as I need, and then I'll just cut them out. I'm not going to be joining them because I'm doing a whole bunch of fabric. Each of these pieces will be pretty long. So I'm not counting on the fact that I'll need to join them. If I do need to join one, I'll just do one join. So I'm not making continuous bias tape, the one that you make from a square. I'm just using the whole fabric for it. I'm going to bind these and then press the seam open. Now, I don't do that binding in 2 steps where you would sew it into the crease, flip it, and then sew again. I think that's a waste of time, but it is a traditional way of sewing it. So let me just show you. You can see all the folds of the bias tape. I'll just choose one of these creases and align it against the raw edge. Pretend the pins are sewing right there. So once I've sewn all of the shoulder area with my bias tape, I would then flip this, wrap around the raw edge. There is a folded edge on that side, and then I would sew again. If you want to do that and do extra seams, that is all fine by me. I'm just not doing that. I'm just going to fold it right now. So I'm just going to fold it and I'm just going to wrap it around in one go like this. And I'm just going to be doing one seam. And I think it's perfectly acceptable. I've sewn so many garments this way and it's just less thread with the same effect. It looks the same. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I think it turns out neat. I've caught the bias tape on both sides and the raw edges are neatly wrapped. This is a seam where both edges have been done separately. The finish here is with binding. It keeps the edges super neat. And it's one alternative to finish wool projects on the inside. I love this finish, especially when something's not going to be lined. It's so nice. This does take a long time. Now, there are 2 techniques that I know are super popular here in the sewing community that I see a lot of people showing off sometimes. Look at my flat felled seams, or look at my French seams. And I'm all for those seams if you're working with a lighter fabric. But for wool fabrics, I personally find them super bulky. I don't even use those techniques for linen. I just find them extremely bulky. Imagine how bulky that would be with wool. Maybe if you have an extremely lightweight wool, it would be okay. I'm just saying it's something that you can consider, but I wouldn't put that type of seam finish at the top of the list. I wouldn't say it's amazing, it's better, or it's superior to serging or binding. So that's just my opinion on those types of seam finishes. You know, you have a think about it and see what you want to do. Flat felled seams means you need to top stitch, and I think that could look horrible on some wool projects. So just think about that. And then pinking scissors. I would only use that if my item was fully lined and it's going to be fully closed in, like with a coat or a blazer where it's lined and the lining is closed in at the hem, which means there's never going to be exposure to elements and things with those seams. So I wouldn't pink something to wear, like just a single layer, no seam finish, just pinking. That's just not my jam. I know a lot of people swear by it, but I would not do that with the wool material. What about pressing your seams? I suggest you press as you go, or maybe not as you go rigidly, like sew a seam, press a seam, sew a seam, press a seam. You might want to accumulate maybe 2 or 3 seams until it's really necessary that you have those seams pressed before you go on to the next ones. Like for example, I would definitely want to press side seams before setting in sleeves and things like that. So definitely it's super important. It's not as simple as just going to the machine, grabbing your iron and going for it. There's more to it because the fabric can scorch, it can get really shiny, it can get pretty awful if you don't take some precautions. Here is my garment, pretty wrinkled. I've done a few seams and I'm at a stage where I want to press them open. So you can see these are bound seams. Now I always want to use a press cloth. I don't want to be scorching my wool, which can happen. And it can even happen from the inside of the garment. This is a silk press cloth. It's a little bit wrinkled, ignore that. I have wool settings on my iron. I have a lot of water in there because I'm going to throw a lot of steam right here. And I'm going to do this in sections. So I'm only going to do this bottom area because after I've got the fabric nice and damp with all the heat and the steam, I'm just going to let this book stay there for a little bit. I don't have a clapper. A clapper would be ideal. It's made out of wood. It absorbs the moisture and keeps it in there and makes the seams lie nice and flat. But a nice heavy book like this one can also work. If your book has those covers that go around it with the design, the title of the book, get rid of that. Just leave the cardboard area of it. Won't leave it that long. So you can clearly see where the book was. And then I'll do the rest of the seam up here on the top. And it's the same. Up and down, up and down. If you do want to move your iron, do it up and down a little bit, never side to side. You don't want to distort the way that this was weaved. So up and down is good. Lots of steam there, and then let your book rest. A clapper is usually longer. It could take more of a section of a seam than a book can. But a book is good for me. I just cannot find a clapper to buy. I can't find one. I don't have one. If I ever find one, I'll be happy to have it. But for now, this works. And there is my seam. Super nice, super flat. From this side, it's going to look amazing. If I feel that I don't need to press on the right side of the fabric, I will try to avoid it. If I do want to give it a light press on the other side as well, of course, I would use the cloth. So keep your press cloth handy. Keep a clapper, keep a book, keep something handy as well if you're going to be working with wool. It's going to make a huge difference. If I ever find a clapper to buy, I will buy one. I just have never seen a place that sells them ever in my whole life. So yeah, I don't have one. If you have one, good for you. Please use it. It's going to make a difference. Hems are special with wool, not just because it's harder to do or something like that, but for some coats, some blazers, in some instructions, you'll see that you interface the bottom edges that are going to be folded up. That helps it be more stable, heavier. It gets rid of that puffy look that you get sometimes with wool. So when I made my legging coat from Each to Stitch, we were interfacing a width at the bottom of the hem for every single skirt piece, and also here at the bottom of the sleeves. When I made my trench coat, the same instruction, interface the bottom edges. So that's something that you might find in instructions. And if you think that your fabric deserves it and it's not in the instructions, then maybe you just want to do it yourself. Add about a 2 or 3 inch rectangle there to the bottom. Tricot knit interfacing works really well. It keeps the flexibility of the fabric and achieves the purpose. And it's also going to be easier for you to hem afterwards. Now, what I would never do with these projects is sew it with the machine. Oh, that would be so awful. It would just look horrific in my opinion. If you ever go to a nice shop and look at coats and wool blazers and capes and things, skirts, you won't see machine hems. You just won't see it. They probably do it with machines, you know, with those invisible techniques on the inside and such. I don't do those. I just hand hem. Hand hem, easy peasy. Everyone can do it. It's relaxing and you can just sit down and do it and it'll be amazing. It'll last and it'll give you that smooth, beautiful finish on the outside. I'm doing this hem by hand. I have a matching thread. I take a fiber here from the jumper and then a little bit from the hem. And I go over and over, about 1/4 inch apart. I've never had a hand hem fall out or start breaking or that I have to redo it over time, maybe once or twice in like 30 plus years of sewing. So if you take your time and do it nicely and you wear your clothes normal, you know, they're not going to fall out. And then look how clean it looks on this side. On this fabric, if I just machined it, it would look horrific. So I'm just taking my time. About the lining. As I mentioned before, this can be a con because usually the fabric is nice and scratchy. Usually you do need to line it. Just make sure that if you don't know how to line, you find a pattern that does include that so that you don't get frustrated with the process. There is no possible way I could wear this against my skin. I find it a little bit scratchy, as most wool and wool blends are. So this needs to be lined and I don't want anything flashy. I want something discreet, and what better than a black lining inside. This is just poly satin lining. It's actually lining material. I would not make clothes out of this. It's extremely soft, very, very soft on the skin, lightweight, easy to work with. So that is going to be my lining. What I did with my Coda jacket was line it in a way that was super easy, and that's because the pattern is finished all of the way around with binding, even the hem areas. So that means I cut my lining and my main pieces exactly the same, and then I just put them together, wrong sides together, and then just basted all the edges before sewing on the binding, which made it super easy. This is not the same as interlining because when you interline, you put the lining and the main fabric together and then you sew your main pieces. I'm not a fan of that. Typically, it turns out really bulky, so I would not do that with wool. I would not interline, I would line. But in this specific case with the Coda coat from Love Notions, it was really, really easy to do. Now, if you have another pattern that has facings on the inside, collars and such, then creating the lining pieces is different because you need to take into account all that space that the facing is going to take up from the inside. Your lining pieces are going to be smaller. You need to add some ease to the lining. You need to make it longer so it doesn't pull up the hem of the main piece. So it's quite involved if you don't know how to create your own lining pieces. So if you want to line, just choose something that's easy to achieve or choose a pattern that has the lining technique all included in there as well. Another garment I lined last year was the Pianoforte jumper from Love Notions. You can see it there on the table. I chose a really scratchy wool blend material. There's no way I could have worn that just normal. I added my own cotton lawn lining on the inside, super beautiful. I have a full sew along on Patreon for that pattern, and I did show how I created the lining pieces there. It wasn't too hard here because it was just a facing, and then I sewed the lining to the facing and then it went all the way down. So some garments are easier to line than others. Skirts, easy to line. This jumper was super easy, but I'd say a jacket or a coat could be more complex. A lot of wool materials are not that densely woven, with the exception of like a wool twill or something. Most of them are fairly loosely woven, which means that they're more prone to stretching out, especially in rounded areas considered that have a bias cut, like a V neckline or a round neckline, armholes, slanted pocket openings, so you do need to stabilize. Before I do anything, I want to stay stitch. This fabric will stretch out. It's just not a stable fabric, but I would do this regardless. I'm doing the neckline. I always do these directionally from the shoulder into the center, and then on the other side I do the same thing. I just flip the fabric. This is the back neckline here. Continuing on the back piece, I'm doing the back armholes, going from the shoulder out to the side seams directionally for both layers. For the armholes on the front, it's going to be composed of 2 pieces to complete that armhole. First, a short little section from the side front pieces, and then we're going to have an interface section from the center front pieces that will compose the entire armhole. I'm doing all of this with a straight stitch, regular stitch length within the seam allowance. The seam allowance here is going to be 3/8, so this is smaller than 3/8. And then I'm also stay stitching the front neckline, the slanted, the V section that could easily stretch out. Even though this is interfaced, it could still happen, so I'd rather be safe than sorry. So that is non-skippable, but that is not the only way that you can stabilize. And before having fusible stay tape, which is amazing, I have that now, I just used to cut long strips of interfacing, 1/2 inch wide, and I would just fuse those onto the areas that I thought were problematic. You can see that this material is slightly textured. It's not very tightly woven either, so the risk of this stretching out is quite big. I don't want to run the risk. I also want to stabilize these so they can be nice and firm for a long time. So I'm going to be stabilizing armholes and necklines instead of stay stitching. Now in the past, I didn't have any fusible stay tape. Now I do. This is a bias cut one with a cord in the middle. This side, the smooth side, is the fusible side. And it's cut on the bias so it conforms to curves, which is amazing. That cord in there is going to keep this area nice and stable. So I'm going to cut the length that I need right here. So as soon as I cut this pattern piece, I brought it over. I haven't moved it. I haven't done anything to manipulate it so that I can get this done quickly and have a safe armhole and neckline. If you don't have this type of fusible stay tape, then you can just cut strips of interfacing, and that's what I've done in the past. I just cut them at 3/8 and just mold them there to the shape. So once I'm done with this side, I'm going to flip and do the same on the other side. This is the back piece. I'm going to repeat the same with the front armholes and all the pieces that need this. I'm also going to interface the slanted edge of the pocket. This material is going to fray like crazy. I don't even trust that stay stitching is going to keep this waist nice and stable. So I'm going to use fusible stay tape instead of stay stitching. And I'm just going to fuse this all along the top edges of the skirt right here. When I sew on the waist finish, it'll be sewn at 3/8. So I'm going to make sure this stay tape is going to involve that area, so it's a little bit away from the edge right there. Okay, and now you can see that this is super stable. It's not going to stretch out, and it's going to be nice and long lasting as we wear the garment. This is just because of the type of fabric I'm using. If this was a cotton twill or a denim or linen, I probably wouldn't do all of this, but this wool suiting material deserves that special treatment right there. So please take your time and stabilize those areas. It's going to make a huge difference in the way the garment fits. You're not going to have gaping armholes, gaping necklines, gaping pockets. All of that is very, very important. I don't think you should skip it. I think the bare minimum here you could do is stay stitch. But then the superior method would be to stabilize with interfacing or fusible stay tape. Something else I'm going to mention about wool fabrics is little details that you might see in patterns and how that can relate to your fabric. So some fabrics are very loosely woven. They will fray like no tomorrow. Boucle, I'm talking to you. There's others as well that I've sewn that I'm like cutting and basically serging as I go because it's just so terrible. Also, the weave is quite thick, like you can see the threads. It's not dense like wool twill, for example. So if you see a fabric like that, make sure you choose something that's relatively simple. Don't add welt pockets, tower plackets, anything that you think needs precision cutting and snips into corners and things like that. I think down the line you can end up with a disaster. So I have done a few tricks to get around that, just to get the look of a tower placket with one garment. For this jacket, I used a pattern where there was a tower placket. Now, because this was loosely woven and fraying and a very delicate fabric, I was not happy to do the cuts that you need to do, precision cutting into this type of tower placket. So that is a feature on a pattern that I wouldn't want to do with a fabric like this. So I did a fake tower placket, which means I created a piece of linen with the same shape and I just sewed it on top. It's top stitched, looks like a tower placket. I even put the buttons, but it's actually just fake. Something to think about if you want to get the look but not have the risk of having a hole down the line. This is a fabric that snags easily. Look, there's even a little snag there, even after a few wears. Delicate fabric, some wools are like this, others are not that delicate, but have a think about the details you want to keep. I wouldn't do welt pockets on a fabric like this either. So this one is full of patch pockets. Patch pockets are very safe. All you're doing is sewing it on top. There's no cutting into little corners and all of that thing. That was my work around it. With those types of fabrics, I'd be happy to sew on 1,000 patch pockets, all of those things, but I would stay away from really tricky techniques. that require precision, because your threads are just going to be fraying and it's going to expand and you're going to have a mess. It's not the same though with my husband's suits, for example. Those wools are perfectly fine. They're full of welt pockets and all sorts of techniques. It's just not the same. You know, all these wool fabrics, they're not made the same. They're not weaved the same. They're not all that dense. Some are very densely woven and others are not. So it's something to think about when you're matching your pattern to your fabric. As with any garment, I think you should take your time to choose what's going to be the best for each one. I hope this was helpful. I know it doesn't contain all the information in the world about wool. If you have anything extra to add, leave it down in the comments. I always like to know your intake about these topics as well. You might have experiences with wool, let me know. That's all from me. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you again on this channel with more sewing very soon. Bye.